There is a powerful assumption people often make when they talk about narcissistic betrayal that the narcissist hurts someone, walks away, finds another person, and simply continues living as though nothing happened. Meanwhile, the person they betrayed is left carrying the emotional consequences, but human psychology is rarely that simple. Sometimes the person who appears to have won the breakup is actually losing something far more important beneath the surface. Not because some mysterious force immediately punishes them, not because instant karma suddenly arrives, but because their own behavior can destroy an emotional environment they depended on more deeply than they ever realized. When we say betrayal can ruin a narcissist's life, we aren't necessarily talking about financial collapse, public humiliation, or obvious failure. Someone can still look successful. They can remain socially active, attractive, confident, and surrounded by people. From the outside, everything may appear perfectly fine. The consequences can be much quieter. They can involve emotional disconnection, unstable relationships, constant dissatisfaction, and the gradual loss of genuine emotional security. And one of the first things they may destroy is the very relationship that provided them with an unusually deep level of patience and understanding. Think about what genuine loyalty actually looks like. Most people are supportive when circumstances are comfortable, but someone deeply invested in a relationship may remain present even when things become confusing, disappointing, or emotionally difficult. They try to understand before judging. They search for reasons before giving up. They continue offering emotional energy even when they aren't receiving the same level of care in return. The irony is that extraordinary loyalty can eventually become invisible to the person receiving it. What once felt special becomes normal. Patience becomes expected. Forgiveness becomes assumed. Support becomes something they feel entitled to rather than something they appreciate. And this is where a dangerous belief begins forming. If they forgave me before, they'll forgive me again. If they stayed after everything else, they won't leave now. If they've always understood me, they'll keep understanding me. Your compassion gradually stops being perceived as a choice. It starts being treated as a permanent resource. That changes behavior. People tend to protect what they genuinely believe they could lose. But when someone becomes convinced that another person will remain regardless of what they do, accountability can disappear. They become careless. They take more risks. They dismiss boundaries. They assume another apology will repair whatever they damage. One betrayal becomes something they believe can be fixed, then another broken promise. Eventually, they are no longer making decisions based on reality. They are operating from the assumption that your love has no limit. But every person has a threshold, and reaching that threshold doesn't necessarily mean the love disappears. Sometimes it means self-respect finally becomes stronger than the desire to keep tolerating the same cycle. That realization usually doesn't happen overnight. It develops through accumulation. One disappointment follows another. Another promise is broken. Another apology sounds almost identical to the previous one. Another cycle begins. And eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The person who once kept asking, "How can I make this relationship work?" starts asking something completely different. Why am I the only one trying to make it work? That question can become a turning point because once someone stops focusing on potential and starts looking honestly at repeated behavior, manipulation becomes much harder to maintain. And there is another shift happening at the same time. The narcissist may have become accustomed to receiving emotional reactions from you. They pull away and you move closer. They criticize and you start explaining yourself. They become distant and you increase your effort. Then they offer a small moment of affection and suddenly hope returns. Over time, this pattern can create a powerful sense of predictability. They begin assuming that your reactions are automatic. They no longer see you as someone making independent choices. They see you as someone who will always respond exactly as expected. That creates a psychological illusion of permanence. They become comfortable because they believe they already know how the story ends. No matter what they do, you'll remain available. But eventually, the pattern can break. Not through revenge, not through some elaborate attempt to punish them, simply through exhaustion and clarity. You stop chasing, you stop defending yourself against accusations that never deserved endless explanations. You stop trying to convince someone of your worth. You stop reacting to every withdrawal, every provocation, and every small return of affection. And this is the moment they may discover something they never expected. Your presence was never guaranteed. The person they assumed would always be there was actually choosing to stay. And once that choice disappears, the entire emotional system they had become accustomed to can begin falling apart. This is where the consequences of betrayal become much deeper than they imagined. Because they didn't simply lose someone who loved them, they may have destroyed the one relationship in which they were offered patience, understanding, emotional investment, and repeated opportunities to change. And by the time they recognize the value of what they lost, the person they took for granted may no longer be willing to return. That is the part they never saw coming. They thought your love made you permanently available. They failed to understand that your love was precisely what made your presence valuable in the first place. And once you finally choose peace over the cycle, they are left facing a reality they never prepared themselves for. You were not their guarantee. You were their opportunity. There is something most people misunderstand about narcissistic betrayal. They assume the narcissist hurts someone, walks away, finds a new relationship, and continues life without any meaningful consequences. Meanwhile, the person who was betrayed is left carrying all the emotional pain. But the psychological reality can be much more complicated. When we say betrayal can eventually ruin a narcissist's life, we are not necessarily talking about obvious failure, public humiliation, or their entire world suddenly collapsing. They may still look successful, they may appear confident, attractive, socially active, and surrounded by people. The consequences can exist somewhere much deeper. What may gradually disappear is their sense of genuine emotional security. The first damage often begins before the relationship even ends. They slowly destroy an emotional environment they may never fully understand the value of until it is gone. A deeply loyal person offers something very different from ordinary admiration. They don't only remain when everything is easy, they may stay through confusion, disappointment, emotional instability, and difficult periods. They try to understand before judging. They look for explanations before giving up. They invest patience and emotional energy that most people would eventually stop offering. And strangely, this kind of loyalty can become invisible when it is available for too long. What once seemed extraordinary starts feeling normal. Your patience becomes expected. Your forgiveness becomes assumed. Your emotional support becomes something they believe will always be available. That is where the narcissist can make a critical psychological mistake. They begin thinking, if they forgave me before, they'll forgive me again. If they stayed after everything I've already done, why would they leave now? If they have always understood me, they'll continue understanding me. Your compassion is no longer experienced as a gift. It becomes an expectation. And expectations often create carelessness. People generally protect what they believe they could lose. But when someone becomes convinced that another person will never leave, they can become increasingly reckless with that person's trust. The narcissist becomes less careful, less accountable, more dismissive. They start believing that every lie can eventually be repaired, every broken promise can be followed by another apology, and every betrayal can somehow be survived. Without realizing it, they are building their behavior around one completely false assumption. Your love has no limit, but everyone has a threshold. Reaching that threshold doesn't always mean the love suddenly disappears. Sometimes it means a person finally values their own peace enough to stop accepting the same pattern repeatedly. And that realization rarely arrives in one dramatic moment. It develops slowly. One disappointment becomes another. Another promise is broken. Another apology sounds exactly like the ones before it. Another cycle repeats itself. Eventually, the loyal person stops asking, "How do I save this relationship?" and starts asking, "Why am I the only one trying to save it?" That question changes everything. Because once someone stops judging the relationship by its potential and starts judging it by its repeated reality, manipulation becomes much harder to maintain. At the same time, another psychological dependency may have developed. The narcissist becomes accustomed to your reactions. They withdraw and you pursue. They criticize and you explain. They become distant and you increase your effort. Then they suddenly show warmth and your hope returns. After enough repetitions, they can begin assuming these reactions are guaranteed. They stop recognizing that you are making choices. Instead, they begin believing they already know exactly what you will do. That creates a dangerous illusion of permanence. They think they know the future. No matter what happens, you will still be there. Then one day, the pattern changes. You stop chasing. You stop defending yourself against accusations that don't deserve endless explanations. You stop trying to convince them to understand something they already know. You stop reacting to every withdrawal and every small display of affection, not because you're trying to punish them, because you're tired, because you've finally chosen peace over the cycle. From your perspective, it may feel like a simple decision to protect yourself. From their perspective, something much more unsettling has happened. Reality is no longer following the emotional script they became dependent on. For the first time, they cannot confidently predict what happens next, and that uncertainty can expose how much comfort they had taken from believing they controlled the rhythm of the relationship. This is where the consequences they never expected can begin, because their greatest mistake was not simply betraying someone who loved them, it was believing that person would remain forever available to forgive the betrayal. Once that assumption collapses, everything built upon it begins to collapse as well. And when they eventually realize you are genuinely gone, they may try to recreate what they lost. A new relationship begins. There is fresh attention, new admiration, new promises, new excitement. From the outside, it may look like they have completely moved on, but replacing a person is not the same as replacing the emotional experience that person provided. They may believe they simply need to find someone else. What they fail to understand is that what made the previous connection valuable wasn't merely the individual. It was the extraordinary combination of patience, forgiveness, emotional investment, understanding, and continued hope that existed within the relationship. They may search for someone who will love them in exactly the same way, but the problem follows them. Eventually, the excitement of a new relationship becomes ordinary life. Differences appear, boundaries are established, disagreements happen. The new person may not tolerate the same behavior. They may leave sooner. They may refuse to endlessly explain themselves. They may choose their own peace before the relationship becomes destructive. And suddenly, the narcissist begins encountering a familiar pattern with a different person. The faces change. The cycle doesn't. That is why changing relationships does not automatically create internal change. The narcissist may believe they lost one person when psychologically they have lost something much larger. They lost certainty. They lost predictability. They lost someone who repeatedly tried to understand them instead of immediately walking away. Most importantly, they lost someone who gave the relationship countless opportunities to become healthier. And once that opportunity is gone, they may begin looking for it everywhere. But genuine emotional safety cannot be recreated through charm or appearances. It cannot be secured through attention, status, or success. It requires honesty, consistency, accountability, emotional responsibility. And those are precisely the qualities that become difficult to maintain when someone continues protecting their defenses instead of confronting their behavior. Here lies the deepest irony. While the narcissist may be searching outward for another person to recreate what they lost, the person they betrayed may be rebuilding inward. They are learning to trust themselves again. They are discovering that peace feels better than constant uncertainty. They are realizing that love does not require endless tolerance. And eventually, they may reach a place where they no longer need the narcissist to regret what happened. They simply understand why they had to leave. That is the consequence the narcissist may never have anticipated. They didn't lose someone because that person stopped caring. They lost someone because caring was no longer enough to make them tolerate being repeatedly hurt. And by the time they understand the difference, the person they once believed would always return may have already chosen a life where their presence is no longer necessary. The empath eventually reaches a place where they trust their own judgment again. They stop questioning whether their boundaries are somehow unfair. They stop feeling guilty for protecting their peace. Most importantly, they stop believing that loving someone means endlessly sacrificing themselves for that person. They begin to understand something they once struggled to accept. Patience cannot create change in someone who refuses to examine their own behavior. Slowly, their sense of emotional security moves from the relationship back into themselves. And that creates two completely different paths. The empath begins needing less reassurance from other people because they have learned to trust their own instincts. The narcissist, however, may continue searching externally for validation, attention, control, and reassurance. With time, those paths move further and further apart. But perhaps the most significant consequence of betrayal isn't regret, it's repetition. Without genuine self-reflection, a person can continue rebuilding the same emotional dynamic with different people. Every new relationship may begin with excitement. Everything feels different at first. The attention feels new. The connection feels promising. The future looks completely different. Then familiarity arrives. And once the relationship becomes emotionally real, the same defensive patterns can return. Accountability turns into blame. Trust is replaced by control. Vulnerability is replaced by performance. Difficult conversations become something to escape rather than something to face. The names and faces change, but the emotional structure remains remarkably similar. Meanwhile, the empath has stepped outside the cycle, not because they stopped believing in love. They simply learned that love without mutual responsibility eventually stops feeling like connection and starts feeling like survival. That is a lesson the narcissist may understand only after the opportunity to change the relationship has already disappeared. They believed your loyalty was permanent. They assumed your forgiveness would always be available. They thought your compassion could absorb one betrayal after another. What they never considered was the possibility that eventually your self-respect would become stronger than your hope. And when that happens, everything changes. This is why we need to understand the title of this conversation correctly. The betrayal itself didn't magically destroy the narcissist's life. The deeper consequence came from repeatedly choosing temporary control over genuine connection, from choosing dishonesty over accountability, from protecting short-term emotional gratification at the expense of something that could have provided lasting security. By the time they finally recognize what they lost, the empath may have already changed in ways the narcissist never expected. They no longer measure love by emotional intensity. They no longer confuse beautiful apologies with actual transformation. They no longer abandon themselves simply to keep another person comfortable. And most importantly, they understand that peace is not something they should have to negotiate for. The narcissist's greatest loss, then, is rarely the relationship by itself. It is losing someone who was willing to see beyond the surface while still believing there was something worthwhile underneath. Someone who saw the flaws but continued hoping for growth. Someone who offered opportunities to repair what had been damaged. The tragedy is that the empath's hope wasn't what destroyed the relationship. The repeated betrayal of that hope did. And once hope finally gives way to clarity, the old dynamic becomes almost impossible to restore. No manipulation can completely recreate the person who once tolerated everything. That is the consequence they never expected. You didn't necessarily stop caring overnight. You simply reached a point where caring about them could no longer require abandoning yourself. And from that moment forward, the life they once assumed they could always return to quietly disappeared. There is one final psychological truth worth understanding. A narcissist may believe betrayal is something they control. They may think they decide when trust is broken, when forgiveness should happen, and when the relationship can simply restart. But trust doesn't operate according to those rules. Trust is created gradually through consistent behavior, and it can disappear just as gradually through repeated disappointment. The difficult part is that the narcissist may not notice the process while it is happening. By the time they realize your trust is gone, it may have been weakening for months or even years. Every broken promise taught you something. Every contradiction made you pay closer attention to behavior instead of words. Every betrayal gave you another reason to stop believing promises that weren't supported by action. Eventually, you stopped asking whether they meant what they said. You started looking at what they actually did. And that shift is powerful because once someone learns to evaluate reality instead of potential, words lose the ability to erase patterns. This is also why regret can arrive at the wrong time. The narcissist may begin feeling the weight of your absence precisely when you have already started healing from the relationship. While they were assuming another opportunity would eventually appear, you were slowly accepting the reality they refused to acknowledge. You were learning that love cannot survive indefinitely where respect repeatedly disappears. You were discovering that forgiveness without change simply creates another opportunity for the same wound. Eventually, the relationship no longer feels like home. It feels like emotional survival. And once that transformation occurs, going backward becomes extremely difficult. The narcissist may continue searching for the version of you who once forgave everything. But that version of you is gone. Not because you became cold, because you became aware. In their place stands someone who understands their own value, recognizes their limits, and no longer needs another person's approval to protect their peace. And perhaps that is the deepest consequence of all. The greatest act of love is not always giving someone one more chance. Sometimes it is finally giving yourself the peace you should never have had to beg for in the first place. That is the moment the old relationship truly ends, not when you stop loving them, but when you finally understand that loving someone else should never require you to lose yourself.